All right, here we go. This is the first of 3 videos on McKay's Chapter 25, The West and the World. And in these videos, we're going to look at imperialism, specifically what we call new imperialism, and how the European powers went out and carved up the world for their own benefit. And we're going to start with this political cartoon here, which is about China. But what's interesting about it is there's also similar cartoons about Africa. And it just tells us here that if it's Africa, if it's China, if it's wherever we are here in this chapter, typically what we're talking about is European powers competing over who's going to get what in the world. And that's a big, big, big part of this unit. So we're talking about the era of new imperialism. So what was old imperialism? Old imperialism is what we consider to be the age of exploration. So when Spain and Portugal were in the Americas, when England and France were in North America, when the Dutch had made it into the Indian Ocean and were beginning the Dutch East Indies trade, that's the old era of imperialism. And then it sort of hits a lull for a while in the 17th century, in the 18th century, and then we hit the new era of imperialism in the late 19th century in particular. This new era is fueled by the Second Industrial Revolution. It is motivated by the competition that's brewing in Europe. And a lot of historians see it as a final phase in Western advancement. So you get industrialized, and then you go out and you colonize. Is the next piece to that system. So the West and the rest. Global inequalities were on the rise during the Industrial Revolution, and a lot of people would argue that the global inequalities that we see today were birthed out of this time period. Those who industrialized rapidly gained power and wealth, so those would be the industrial nations of Europe. But the lopsided world that developed during this time is actually institutionalized by the industrial process of the West. Now, what do we mean by that? It means that you get to this point where if you're industrialized and someone isn't, it makes it very difficult systematically for the non-industrialized nation to actually catch up. So in a way, it keeps those countries down. Third world, we call the third world is the developing countries of the world, so those non-industrial or becoming industrial nations today. But third world countries, the wages in those countries and the standard of living are significantly lower through the entire period that we're talking about and even still today. So here's a chart that we see in McKay, and this is average income per person in 1960 US dollars. Okay, so check this out. And we only use 1960 because this might be when this study was done, and it's adjusted for inflation over the years. Obviously, 1960 dollars are different than 1750 dollars. Dollars didn't even exist. But anyways, so let's look at a couple different things here, and let me try to get a pen going. So this top track right here is Great Britain, and the average income per person in Great Britain, and this purple track right here is all the developed countries on average. The first thing we'll notice right here is that Great Britain, throughout the Industrial Revolution and all the way up to World War I at least, and then beyond through World War II, had a greater average income per person than the entire developed world combined. So that just reinforces this idea that we've been talking about, that Great Britain is the wealthiest country during this time period in history. Germany is obviously catching up. They are a serious threat, but Great Britain is the wealthiest country at this time. Something else I want to bring your attention to is look at this. Look at this. Look at the difference between Great Britain right here and the developing countries, the third world, at 1750, at the eve of the agricultural revolution. Their standard of living is essentially the same, but as we go through the agricultural revolution, it starts to change. As we go through the Industrial Revolution, it blows up. Huge difference right here. In fact, the difference after the Industrial Revolutions are over is massive. And look, it even continues to climb. Now, we do see that after World War II and through 1970 at least, the developing world is starting to increase their cost of, I'm sorry, not the cost of living, their quality of living through wages. And that would even continue this trend. I bet if we looked at a chart, would continue with the rise of China, Brazil, etc. However, you'll look that during the Industrial Revolution, they actually take a dip. It actually gets worse if you're poor during the Industrial Revolution, and that's interesting. So this is what we're talking about here when it's institutionalized during the Industrial Revolution. The poor countries of the world actually get slightly poorer, and the gap between those countries and the industrialized countries is massive. So real quick, let's set some ground rules. Why would countries go out and get colonies? Why imperialism? There are kind of four main reasons we're going to see throughout this chapter. The first one is markets. We're going to talk about that in a minute. Basically, there are massive amounts of people in the world to sell your products to. So as we're cranking out, widgets and textiles, hundreds of units an hour, we need somebody to sell them to. We've sold them to everybody in Europe, so let's go out and sell them to the rest of the world. Strategy, keeping your rivals out of your territory or from gaining strength. Remember that this is becoming a very competitive Europe at this time. So we got to take this territory. Why? Because Germany can't have it. Or we got to take this territory. Why? Because it really ruins France's day. So strategy is the reason. Pride, boosting nationalism. Nationalism, the nation state, the responsive nation state is what we just talked about. This is a way to continue to boost that and continue to get your people to fall in line with your government. It's also a great way to distract from domestic problems. Oh, let's go, start a war somewhere in a colony to distract people from the problems here at home. And then resources, raw materials necessary for manufacturing, specifically minerals in Africa, rubber in Africa. We'll be looking at diamonds in South Africa. We'll be looking at indigo and tea in India, opium coming from the poppies in India and then sold to China. So resources and raw materials are another big part of this as well. But let's talk about those world markets for a second. McKay gives us this stat in the book. In 1820, 50% of Great Britain's products were exported outside of Great Britain. Of that 50%, 50% of those exports went to Europe. They never even left the continent. Only 6% of those exports went to India, their crown jewel colony. Okay, just 30 years later, in 1850, 25% of those exports are going to India. Only 16% are staying in Europe. So this just shows us that how important these colonies become. The colonies become massive markets for their products to be sold. And the great thing about it too is if you're a colony, you can't make your own decisions. So you're not allowed to raise tariffs. You're not allowed to engage in protective trade policies, like the old corn laws in Great Britain. So Great Britain also saw a large amount of imports come in after the repeal of the corn laws in 1846, especially raw materials. And railroads were built in the colonies to facilitate cheaper trade. In fact, I think McKay points out that by the end of the 19th century, India has the fourth largest rail system. Now that's not to get Indians around and make their life easier, that's to move products to better facilitate trade and make money. So how do we get out into the world? We're going to look at China, Japan, and Egypt in this video. So let's start with China, the opening of China, which is really a forced opening of China. China is one of the oldest civilizations in the world. It goes back 5,000 years, still is. It's one of the oldest continual civilizations in the world. It was a dominant power in Asia. It actually was wealthier and better off and more advanced than Europe all the way through up to the Industrial Revolution, you could even argue. It was just doing its own thing. So it was a dominant power in Asia, made trade connections with Europe through the Silk Road, as we've talked about at the beginning of the course. It was mostly self-sufficient due to geography. It had what it needed. It was on the coast. Actually, most of the 90%, I think, of China's population lives in just the eastern one-third of the country, right on the coast. It has minerals, it has farming, it has resources. So it's self-sufficient, doesn't have to go out for a lot. It's got a big population, huge labor pool. This, however, is a great investment opportunity for Europe. They see this as a great place to make money, and that's why they're going to force their way in here. So until the 1820s, trade in China was actually restricted to one port in Canton. You could not trade anywhere else if you were a European. It was very strict. The opium trade was technically illegal, but it becomes increasingly lucrative for Great Britain and France. What happens is the British make the opium in India, where the poppy seeds are, and then they ship it right next door to China and sell it to the Chinese and get them hooked just like a good drug dealer would. France, same thing, but they get their poppies from Indochina, which is modern-day Vietnam. The Qing government, which had been in charge, the Qing dynasty had been in charge for quite some time, tried to crack down on this opium trade, and eventually what they said is they would close off the ports completely and force the British to stop selling it by shutting them out. The British didn't like that. The British didn't like the idea that they were going to lose money or be told what to do for that matter. by the Chinese, and this leads to the First Opium War in 1837, which ends in the Treaty of Nanking in 1842. But really quick, a quick thing about the Opium War here is that the Chinese didn't stand a chance against the British Navy. The British Navy is the best in the world. It's the most modernized, the most advanced, and China's junk boats, as we call them, were really junk, and they had not been updated in a long time, and they had no chance against the British. So the British forced their way back into the port in the First Opium War, do a little damage, and then they forced the Chinese to sign the Treaty of Nanking in 1842, which gives Hong Kong to Great Britain, makes the Chinese pay $100 million in indemnity, and it opens up trade in more ports than Canton. So this backfires on the Chinese, even though they're trying to stop this trade, and it actually makes things worse. So as things go along, more people get addicted to opium, specifically the rich, wealthy, bureaucracy of China. They're the ones that get addicted to it, and Chinese people are very upset because the country's not going anywhere, and they're accusing these, bureaucrats of spending the tax money on their opium habit. Not a good situation. So again, the Chinese later on, about a decade later, try to stop the trade of opium or restrict the trade of opium, and that leads to another war over this, the Second Opium War in 1856. This time the French get involved, and it gets a little bit more aggressive. The British occupy with the French Beijing, and they destroy the old summer palace of the emperor just to kind of prove a point. So they're really not happy with the Chinese trying to tell them what to do with the opium trade, and this ends basically the same way as the First Opium War, and with more harsh terms against China. So we see here that China is not officially a colony except for Hong Kong, but it is dominated economically as if it is a colony. And that's how China really, the British and the French and all these other European countries forced their way into this huge market. At this time, China had 300 million people living there, so it was a place where you wanted to sell your stuff. And again, here's a painting of those. You have right here a junk boat being blown up, and then these massive British ships that are just, they're ironclad. This isn't going to end well. All right, so let's force Japan open while we're at it. Japan was an extremely isolated country. From 1640 to 1853, it was completely closed off from the world. They had a problem before 1640 with Dutch traders bringing guns and Christianity, two things they did not want in Shintoist Japan. So the shogun of the time closed it off. So all the way up until 1853, nobody's allowed to leave. If you come back, they kill you. Nobody's allowed in. And it looks essentially like a feudal society from the Middle Ages, all the way through to 1853. In 1853, the U.S. was looking to get into the imperialism game. They're looking for kind of a stopover area in Asia. So they send Commodore Matthew Perry, not the guy from Friends, from the U.S. Navy, to try to open up Japan. And he uses what we call gunboat diplomacy, where he threatens to Japan, either you open up or we will force you open with our big, big ships out there. I'll come back and I'll expect an answer. And he comes back, and Japan, knowing that they can't compete with the U.S. Navy, is forced to open up. And this leads to some serious changes in Japan, which we'll get to in a later video. And we have a new government in Japan by 1867. So the U.S. forced Japan to open. The British and the French are forcing China to trade with Europe just like they want them to. So what's going on in Egypt? Egypt is a little bit different. Egypt practices the policy of defensive modernization. Basically, modernize or be colonized is the philosophy here. So this is what historians call defensive modernization. Muhammad Ali was a Turkish general who took control of Egypt. He became governor of Egypt and decided to kind of take it for himself, away from the Sultan in Turkey, and try to make it its own strong country. My favorite story about Muhammad Ali is he brought all of his rivals to dinner in Egypt, the Mamluk lords, when he was new in town, and poisoned them all at dinner, and that's how he took them out of the game. He's not messing around. We're not messing around. This is AP Euro. So Muhammad Ali, what he does is he says, look, if we don't modernize Egypt, okay, Egypt is going to fall to the Europeans just like everything else. He could see the writing on the wall. So what happens is he forces modernizations in Egypt. He nationalizes the cotton crops, which is a problem, because you got to take that land from landowners who've owned it for a long time. Well, he threatens them, he kills them, whatever. Nationalizes the cotton crop. Anything made off the cotton goes towards the state. He trains a modern army out of the peasants, and he Europeanized